Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive.
Yeah, welcome back.
Today we're going to be looking at a pretty interesting document.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's called the 2015 Statistical Report. It's all about Abu Dhabi's electricity and water.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, and we're basically using this as our cheat sheet to figure out,
Right.
what was going on with power and water in the Emirate, like way back in 2015.
Makes sense.
Yeah, we've gone through all those numbers, all the data on
Yeah.
electricity demand, water demand.
Oh, wow.
Even the fuel they used,
Right.
And we're just going to kind of give you the key stuff, the important points without,
Yeah, no need to bore everyone with all the...
Yeah, exactly. All the
Yeah.
boring details, all the nitty gritty.
Exactly, just the good stuff.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
this report, it's like packed with information.
Oh, yeah, it goes way back, like all the way to 1999.
Wow.
It covers electricity, water, fuel, how much they could produce, even carbon dioxide emissions.
Oh, wow.
And it even tries to predict what's going to happen in the future.
Forecasts. Yeah, forecasts. Exactly.
So, I mean, we're trying to pull out like the really important trends and numbers, right? So you can really understand what was happening in these,
It is complicated stuff.
yeah, these really important sectors.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, the report also kind of lays out how everything is structured, like how it all works, right?
Yeah.
It mentions ADWE,
Mm-hmm.
the Abu Dhabi Water and Electricity Company.
Right.
And it talks about how the money flows and how the resources, like the water and electricity, how that all moves around.
It's like a big puzzle, right?
It sounds complicated, yeah.
Yeah, it is. But once you understand it, it makes sense. So think of ADWC like the main hub, right?
Okay.
They're buying electricity and water from the companies that make it, the producers,
Right.
and then they sell it to the companies that deliver it to us, the distribution companies.
Got it.
And finally, it gets to our homes and businesses.
To us.
Yeah, to you and me.
Uh.
And the money.
Yeah.
Well, that goes in the opposite direction. From us.
Back to the companies, yeah.
Back to the producers.
Yeah.
So it's a whole cycle,
Mhm.
And understanding that cycle helps us really get a grip on the numbers we're going to look at.
All right, so let's jump into those numbers. Let's start with electricity.
Okay, sounds good.
Now, the report has all these tables about like peak demand and minimum demand going way back.
Yeah.
What was the demand like back then?
Well, the interesting thing here is the bigger picture. The story the numbers tell us over time.
Okay.
They give us the highest and lowest points for electricity use across Abu Dhabi from 1999 to 2015.
Wow, that's a long time.
Yeah, and they break it down by region too, Abu Dhabi City, Al Ain, and the Western region.
Okay.
And if you look at the peak annual demand table,
Right.
you can see how much electricity the whole system needed at its busiest times.
It's like when everyone's using their AC at the same time.
Exactly. And it pretty much keeps going up from 1999 to 2015.
So are there any years that really stand out as having like a record high or a record low?
Yeah, definitely. The report actually tells us exactly when those happened.
Interesting.
And while there are some ups and downs,
Yeah.
the trend is basically upwards, especially in the later years.
Okay.
So if you look at the years around the early 2010s, like 2013, 2014,
Yeah.
you'll see some pretty high peaks for the whole system.
Wow.
And the opposite is true too. If you go back closer to 1999, those years have much lower peaks.
Okay. Makes sense.
And minimum annual demand follows the same pattern. It goes up,
Right.
but not as dramatically.
So wait a minute.
Yeah.
This report, it doesn't just tell us the year, it gives us the specific dates
Oh, yeah, it does.
when those peaks and valleys occurred.
It gets really specific.
So are there any like patterns in when these things happen during the year or across the different
Oh,
regions?
absolutely. So, it's super hot in Abu Dhabi, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So it makes sense that the highest demand for electricity usually hits during those scorching summer months.
Like July, August, September.
Exactly. Everyone's blasting their AC.
Yeah, trying to stay cool.
And if you look at the peak annual demand dates, you'll see that pattern a lot.
Okay.
But there can be some regional differences,
Like what?
Well, for example, the Western region, they have a lot of big industries.
Right.
And those industries use a ton of electricity. So their peak demand might be different from Abu Dhabi City,
Oh, interesting.
It might not happen at exactly the same time.
Makes sense.
Now, for the lowest demand, that usually happens during the cooler months.
When it's nice and cool.
Yeah, like January or February, as you can see in the minimum annual demand dates.
Makes sense. You don't need the AC blasting.
Exactly.
Now, the report mentions these system load duration curves.
Okay.
For 2015, what are those all about?
Think of it this way. Imagine we're looking at Abu Dhabi's electricity needs for a whole year, right?
Okay.
The system low duration curve, it's like a visual representation of that.
A picture of their electricity needs?
Yeah, a picture. So you can see how many hours of the year the electricity demand stayed at a certain level. Like how often were they running close to their maximum capacity or at their average level or even at their lowest.
Right, so it shows the whole range.
Exactly. And this is super helpful for planning, you know.
Yeah, so...
Well, imagine you're in charge of making sure there's enough electricity for everyone, right?
Right.
This curve tells you if you need to build more power plants that run all the time.
Right.
Or maybe more power plants that can just kick in when demand gets really high.
Like during those peak hours in the summer?
Yeah, exactly.
But the report just says that this data is available for 2015.
Yeah, that's right.
We don't actually get to see the curve itself.
Unfortunately not. That would have been really interesting to see.
Yeah, maybe in another report.
Maybe.
So it's basically like a yearly electricity diary, and then the report goes on to compare the months with the highest and lowest electricity use.
Makes sense.
During 2015, right?
Yeah, in Abu Dhabi.
In Abu Dhabi, yeah.
So the report is basically highlighting the difference between the busiest month, which is probably August because of the heat,
right,
and the quietest month, which is probably January or February, when it's cooler.
When it's nice and cool.
Exactly. So not only would the peak month have a much higher overall demand,
right,
it would also have a sharper, more intense daily peak.
Because everyone's turning on their AC at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. While the low demand month would probably have a much smoother, lower usage pattern overall.
Interesting. So it's not just about how much electricity is used, it's also about when it's used.
Right. The timing matters a lot, too.
Okay, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about where all this electricity actually comes from, the generation side of things.
That's good.
The report has annual generation numbers all the way back to 1999.
It does.
Yeah.
The annual electricity generation gross kilowatt table shows us the total amount produced in Abu Dhabi each year. And just like with demand, you'll probably notice a general increase in total generation from 1999 to 2015.
Because they needed to make more electricity to meet that growing demand.
Exactly. But what's really interesting is how they spread out that generation.
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, it's not just one giant power plant, right?
Yeah.
They have generation happening in different regions and by different companies.
Right. I see that in the report.
So if you look at annual electricity generation by region, you get to see where the power is being produced across Abu Dhabi, Al Ain, and the Western region.
Got it.
This can tell us a lot, like which areas have the major power plants and how much each region contributes to the total electricity supply.
And has that changed over time?
It might have, and that could be because of new infrastructure investments, you know, building new power plants.
Right.
Or maybe because the energy needs in certain regions changed.
Makes sense.
And then there's the annual electricity generation by company table.
Yeah, that one lists a bunch of different companies.
It does. It shows us who the major players in power generation were during this period.
The big guys.
Yeah, the big guys. And we can see how much electricity each one produced in kilowatt hours.
Right, so we can see who was producing the most.
Exactly.
And the report even goes deeper. It breaks down the generation by the type of generator used.
Oh, yeah. That's a key piece of information.
So what kind of technology was powering Abu Dhabi back then?
Well, the energy generation by type of generator data is really helpful here.
Cool.
It shows us the total gigawatt hours and the percentage of the total for each type of generator.
So we can see the mix of different technologies.
Exactly. And since the region has a lot of natural gas,
right,
it wouldn't be surprising to see that gas turbine power plants were a major source of electricity.
Okay.
But they might have been using other technologies too, and these tables tell us all about that.
Interesting. And by looking at the percentages over time, we can see if they were shifting towards different generation methods.
Exactly. You can see how things were changing.
So it's not just about making the electricity, it's also about making sure it gets to where it's needed.
Right.
The power plants themselves use some of that energy.
Oh, yeah, definitely. For their own operations.
Yeah, the report calls it auxiliary electricity consumption.
Exactly. So annual auxiliary electricity consumption by station basically tells us how much electricity the power plants and the water desalination plants.
They use electricity too.
Yeah, they need it to run their own systems, things like pumps, lighting, all the essential stuff.
It's like a factory that uses some of its own products.
Yeah, a perfect analogy.
To keep things running.
Exactly. And by looking at this internal use, we can figure out how efficient these plants are overall.
Now, what about the flow of electricity beyond Abu Dhabi's borders?
Okay.
The report has sections on exports and imports.
Right, so the annual electricity exports and imports data, along with the monthly data.
Right, monthly electricity exports and imports.
Yeah, those show us how much electricity was traded with neighboring areas.
So basically, sharing power with their neighbors.
Yeah, exactly. There can be different reasons for this, like maybe they had extra electricity at certain times, or maybe they had a planned shutdown for maintenance and needed to get power from somewhere else.
Makes sense.
Or they could even have agreements in place to trade electricity regularly. And by analyzing the trends in these imports and exports, we can see if Abu Dhabi was becoming more connected to other electricity grids.
Interesting.
Or if their trading patterns were changing.
Now, lastly, on the electricity side,
Okay.
the report looks at system weekly electricity peak demand. And it shows that as a percentage of the annual peak. Why is that important?
Well, looking at system weekly electricity peak demand helps us understand how much the need for electricity goes up and down within a year.
Okay.
And how those weekly high points compare to the absolute highest point they hit during the whole year.
Makes sense.
So the percentage basically tells us how often the system is running close to its limit and how much extra capacity they might have at different times.
So it's a way to measure how much they're pushing the system, basically.
Yeah, you could say that.
And there's a mention of a network map.
Yeah.
It's like a visual layout of the electricity system as of summer 2016.
Right. Unfortunately, we don't get to see it in the report.
Yeah, but I'm imagining it would show all the power plants and the transmission lines. Right?
Oh, absolutely. It would show how the electricity travels from where it's made to where it's used all across the region.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground on electricity.
We have.
Let's switch over to the other essential resource. Water?
Sounds good.
Just like with electricity, the report has a lot of data on how much water is produced and supplied.
It does. And remember, Abu Dhabi really depends on desalinated water.
Right, taking the salt out of seawater.
Exactly. They need that for drinking water and everything else.
And the report tells us exactly which organizations and which specific plants are making all that desalinated water.
Yeah. If you look at annual water production by company and annual water production by station, you'll see who the big producers are.
And this covers 1999 to 2015.
Yeah, so we can see if they were able to make more water over time.
Right, to keep up with the growing population.
Exactly.
Now, just like with electricity, the report breaks down water production by region, too.
Yeah, that's right. The annual water production by region and the annual average daily water production by region show us where the water is coming from geographically.
So we can see which parts of Abu Dhabi are producing the most.
Exactly. Abu Dhabi City, Al Ain, the Western region.
Right.
And it also tells us how much they're producing on average every day.
And this can be different depending on things like population. Right?
Yeah, for sure. More people in an area usually means they need more water.
Makes sense.
And of course, it depends on where the desalination plants are located.
Right. They have to build those plants near the coast.
Exactly.
Now, the report also has data on monthly water production by region, so we can see if there are any ups and downs in production throughout the year.
Right, although desalination tends to be pretty consistent.
Because people need water all year round.
Exactly. It's not like AC where you only really need it in the summer.
No, producing the water is just the first step, right? They have to actually get it to the people who need it.
Yeah, the delivery is just as important.
And the report talks about water supply, both by company and by region.
Right, so annual water supply by company and annual water supply by region tell us how much treated water is being distributed.
Okay.
And the regional supply data starts a bit later, in 2005.
Okay.
But we can still see the overall picture.
So who are the main players in delivering the water?
Well, the monthly water supply by company data shows us the key suppliers and whether they deliver more or less water, depending on the time of year.
And just like with the electricity system, there's a mention of a water system network map.
Yeah, this one's from summer 2016.
So this would show all the pipelines and pumping stations and everything.
Exactly. It gives us a visual representation of that whole intricate network that gets water from the desalination plants to people's homes and businesses.
Wow, it must be a huge network.
Oh, yeah. It covers the entire emirate.
Now let's talk about what powers all of this.
Okay.
Literally, the fuel.
Right. The fuel is what makes everything go.
The report has a whole section dedicated to fuel statistics.
It does. And this is important because it shows us what they were using to generate electricity and desalinate water.
Okay, so what were they using?
Well, the annual fuel consumption by company And annual fuel consumption by fuel type tables tell us which companies use the most fuel and what kinds of fuel they were using.
And Abu Dhabi has a lot of oil and gas, right?
Yeah, they do. So it's no surprise that natural gas was a primary fuel source.
Okay, so the report would tell us exactly how much they were relying on natural gas.
It does, and it also shows if...
Now, the report doesn't just look at the big picture. It also breaks down fuel consumption by each individual power and desalination plant, and even by which fuel provider supplied it each month.
Right. So with annual fuel consumption by station, we can see which specific plants were the biggest fuel users.
Right. Makes sense.
And they actually give us the numbers in two ways. The original units of measurement and million British thermal units, or MB2.
Okay, what's that?
MB2. It's just a way to make it easier to compare different types of fuel.
Oh, okay.
And then we have monthly fuel consumption by fuel providers, which is available from 2007 to 2015.
Okay.
That tells us which companies were supplying the fuel.
So we can see the whole supply chain.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's also a map of the main gas supply network as of the end of 2016. So we can literally see how the gas was moving around.
Yeah, and that really highlights how much they depended on natural gas.
Now, let's switch gears one more time and talk about capacity, like how much they could actually produce.
Okay. Capacity is all about potential.
Right. It's like how much electricity and desalinated water they were capable of making.
Exactly. And the report gives us two key figures for each year.
Okay.
Generation capacity, gross MW, at 31st December.
Okay.
And desalination capacity, gross MGD, at 31st December.
Got it.
These numbers tell us the total installed capacity they had at the end of each year.
So like the maximum amount they could produce?
Yeah, if they were running everything at full blast.
And it goes even further, breaking down generation capacity by the technology they use.
Oh, yeah, and also by what's called the prime mover.
Okay, what's the difference?
Well, generation capacity by technology is all about the different methods for making electricity.
Like using gas turbines.
Exactly, gas turbines, combined cycle gas turbines, which are more efficient, and maybe even other technologies. And generation capacity by prime mover focuses on the specific type of engine or turbine that's driving the electricity generator.
So it's like looking under the hood.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh.
And if we track these figures from 1999 to 2016, we can see how they were changing their approach to generating electricity.
Like, were they using more efficient technologies?
Right, exactly.
And the report highlights the available capacity at peak.
That tells us how much capacity they had available during those times when demand was at its highest.
Makes sense. Those are the times when it really matters.
Absolutely.
Now, just like with generation capacity, they break down desalination capacity by technology as well.
Yeah, that's right. So desalination capacity by technology shows us the different processes they were using to get the salt out of seawater.
And what are the main methods?
Well, the most common ones in this region are multi-stage flash distillation, or MSF, and reverse osmosis, or RO.
And what's the difference?
MSF is a thermal process. It uses heat to evaporate the water and leave the salt behind. And RO uses membranes to filter out the salt.
Interesting. So which one is better?
Well, RO is generally considered to be more energy efficient. So the report would show us if Abu Dhabi was starting to use more RO.
Makes sense. They're always looking for ways to be more efficient.
Right.
Now, there's also this comparison in the report between independent water and power producers.
IWPPs.
Yeah, IWPPs, and those that aren't IWPPs. And this is for both generation and desalination capacity.
Right.
So why is that distinction important?
Well, the IWPP model is basically a way for private companies to invest in these big infrastructure projects. So these companies build and operate power and desalination plants. And then they sell the electricity and water they produce to ADWEC under long-term contracts.
Got it.
And by comparing the capacity of IWPPs to non-IWPPs.
Which are usually owned by the government, right?
Yeah, usually state-owned entities. So that comparison shows us how much the private sector is involved in Abu Dhabi's utilities.
Interesting.
And how the ownership and operation of these essential services have changed over time.
So the report gives specific figures for how much capacity is owned by each type?
It does, for both electricity and desalination.
Okay, so we've talked about the electricity, the water, the fuel. What about the environmental impact?
Right. The report doesn't go super deep into that. But it does give us some data on carbon dioxide emissions.
Oh, okay. Clear.
So they calculated CO2 emissions using a specific tool. And that gives us a general idea of the carbon footprint of producing electricity and desalinating water.
And finally, the report gives us a glimpse into the future.
Forecasts.
Yeah. Forecasts, exactly.
Yeah, the report has forecasts for both electricity and water demand.
Okay, so what's the outlook?
Well, the electricity peak demand forecast and water peak demand forecast sections tell us how much they expect demand to grow in the future.
So they're predicting that demand will continue to increase.
They are, and these forecasts are really important for planning purposes.
Right. They need to make sure they can keep up.
Exactly. They need to build enough power plants and desalination plants to meet that future demand.
So looking at all of this data, all these trends, what are some of the really big takeaways from this 2015 report?
Well, I think the most obvious one is that both electricity and water demand were going up significantly.
Okay.
From 1999 to 2015. I mean, that's a clear sign of Abu Dhabi's rapid population growth and economic development.
Right. More people, more businesses, more demand for resources.
Exactly. And they had to keep expanding their capacity, both for generating electricity and desalinating water, just to keep pace.
And what about the technology they were using? Were there any changes there?
Yeah, definitely. For electricity generation, they were still relying heavily on natural gas, but they were also moving towards more efficient gas turbine technology.
Combined cycle gas turbines.
Yeah, exactly, which helps reduce emissions. And for desalination, they seem to be shifting towards reverse osmosis because it uses less energy.
Right, more efficient.
Yeah. And in terms of fuel, natural gas was the main source, but it'll be interesting to see if they start exploring other options in the future.
Like renewables?
Yeah, like solar or wind power.
That could be a big change.
It could. And it would definitely have a big impact on their carbon footprint.
And lastly, there's the increasing role of independent water and power producers.
The IWPPs.
Yeah. So the government is really encouraging private investment in these sectors.
They are, and that's a trend to keep an eye on.
It's amazing how much you can learn just by looking at the numbers.
It is, isn't it?
So we've seen how Abu Dhabi's electricity and water sectors were developing up to 2015. But what about the future? What kind of innovations do you think will be necessary to make sure they can keep up with this growing demand in a sustainable way?
Well, I think we're going to see a big push for energy efficiency.
Across all sectors.
Yeah, across the board. Homes, businesses, industry, everyone will need to use energy more wisely.
Okay.
And I think we'll also see more renewable energy coming into the mix.
Like solar and wind?
Yeah, they have so much sun, and Abu Dhabi is the perfect place for solar power.
Right.
And for desalination, I think we'll see continued improvements in reverse osmosis technology.
Making it even more efficient.
Exactly, using less energy and producing more fresh water.
And all of this will affect Abu Dhabi's carbon footprint.
Oh yeah, for sure. The faster they adopt cleaner energy and more efficient technologies,
the lower their emissions will be.
Exactly.
And this 2015 report gives us a baseline, right?
Yeah, a starting point to measure their progress.
Well, thanks for joining me for this deep dive into Abu Dhabi's electricity and water.
It's been a fascinating look back.
Yeah, it has. And thanks to all of you for listening.
Thanks, everyone.
We'll catch you next time for another deep dive.
See you then.
Bye.